Hey there, just quickly, this video is actually part of a much larger video that I uploaded on the 11th of May. Be sure to check that out if you want to watch all of it at once, but I thought I'd make little versions because I know 4 hours can be quite daunting to some people. So here is the 4th Doctor's era, and let's get straight into it. Season 12 of Doctor Who is another soft reboot for the show, with a new Doctor being brought in, a new companion being introduced, one companion staying from the previous season, and the essential fading out of the unit family that defined the 3rd Doctor's era. One thing to take note of when it comes to Season 12 is the amount of recurring and massive monsters in this season. Only 2 stories have an original monster, one of which isn't that original really and just feels like a leftover from the 3rd Doctor's era, and the other one is actually original. Everything else is recurring villains, some of the biggest ones in fact, and honestly a lot of people don't like this season because of it, and in my opinion, those people are wrong. But let's get into the episodes first so I can explain my reasoning as to why I adore this season as much as I do. Robot's probably one of the weakest stories of this season. Nothing particularly wrong with it, it just very much feels like what would happen if the new Doctor was put in a situation that the previous Doctor excelled in. And as far, it works quite well. I also think that Harry is quite an interesting addition to the TARDIS team. Sarah Jane is of course amazing as always, and the unit regulars, it's nice seeing them one last proper time. But when it comes to the rest of Robot, like the plot, it's stuff we've seen before multiple times between seasons 7 and 11. There's so little new to it that, honestly, it's very bog standard. I understand why they did it, since the old production team was heading out. The new production team was basically being trained during this story. So, I understand why they did it. But at the same time, I think something new and original could have really helped this new Doctor. Even if Tom's incredible performance after his regeneration is one of my favourite post-regeneration mental breakdowns. Overall, it's a 7 out of 10. The arc in space is Alien, but made 4 years before Alien, on a much lower budget with a much lesser known cast, and honestly, it's absolutely perfect. This story is a 10 out of 10, I can tell you that off the bat. It's spooky, it's scary. The bubble wrap, yes, is silly to modern day standards, but at the time it wasn't used that much, so most people didn't know what it was and thought it looked really weird. And honestly, even though the bubble wrap is silly, the actors portraying the amount of emotion and horror needed for this story can kind of pull off the bubble wrap in my opinion. I think this is genuinely one of the best Classic Who stories. It's something I'd highly recommend to people if they prefer the more horror aspects of Classic Who. And yeah, 10 out of 10. Simple as, I love the Warren. End of story. The Sontaran experiment is one of the rare 2-parters of Classic Who, and I think it works really well for the format. It's a very simple story, following on from the previous one, The Ark in Space, and it works really well for me. The shortness of the story allows it to be tight and concise. The characters don't need 50 hours to explain everything to the audience. It's simple. It's a Sontaran doing some experiments on some survivors, and then later on the Doctor, Harry and Sarah. Honestly, this is a great little story. It's really fun. I love how they recycled some elements from the previous Sontaran story and expanded upon them. We get to learn more about how the Sontarans conduct themselves with these kind of experiments. And yeah, it's a fun little 2-parter. It's 45 minutes to 50, same as a modern day episode, and it's paced quite well. Really enjoy this one. It's great. Genesis of the Daleks. I honestly don't even know what to say for this one. It's Genesis of the Daleks. I would go into massive detail about the acting, the performances overall, the level of set design, the amazing writing, the amazing special effects, yada yada yada, the main cast, Davros, but this is Genesis of the Daleks. You know what this is. There's a reason this still tops top 10 lists for Classic Who, still to this day. There's a reason why it's so acclaimed, and why even now the show is referencing back to it. It's Genesis of the Daleks. Do yourself a favour, if you've not watched it, just go and watch it. If you don't like the fact it's a 6-parter, there's a 90-minute, TV movie edit of it, which is just as good. It doesn't cut that much out, really. Yeah, go watch this. 10 out of 10. It's Genesis of the goddamn Daleks. Revenge of the Cybermen is quite an interesting one to end the season on. This is what most people would say is the worst story of season 12, and I don't overly disagree with them, but I think it's a lot more fun than people give it credit for. Yeah, the Cybermen are very much out of character in this story. They show way too many emotions. The plot of it is very silly. The gold thing is very silly. All the stuff in the caves with just constant explosions is very silly, but I feel like that's the point of this story. It's a ridiculous tale. There's so much cheesy acting, so much over-the-top action, so much over-the-top acting, that I just kind of love it. It's stupid in every aspect that I adore classic Who for. I can't give it any more than a 7 out of 10 because that would be straight up wrong. But if you want to just stick some on for 90 minutes and turn your brain off and feel very, very entertained with just how over-the-top everything is, you could do a lot worse than Revenge of the Cybermen. And that's season 12, one of the shortest Classic Who seasons all the way up to season 23, which is when things will start getting much shorter. But honestly, I really love season 12, even Revenge of the Cybermen, which most people do not like. I think you're kind of wrong. It's stupid, it's goofy, give it another shot. But yeah, this season is so incredible. I mean, you can see just from my ratings that are currently on screen how much I love this season. There are just so many 10 out of 10 stories. 2 out of 5 are 10 out of 10s. One of them is an 8, then 2 are 7s. You could do much worse as a season rating. Look at my season 6 one, for example. So, yeah, this is what they look like ranked. Obviously, no shock there. And like I said, I like Robot, it's fun. But I'd honestly say Revenge is more fun because it's just so incredibly stupid. Season 12 is one of my favourite seasons of television overall, and is currently sat at my highest ratings for a season so far. If it ever gets beaten, you'll only have to keep watching to find out, but yeah. Season 12's honestly amazing. I'd highly recommend it to everyone. The collection box set's only £20 at the moment, I think, on Amazon, so give it a go. You may as well. Season 13 continues on from Season 12 and is counted as part of the golden era of classic Doctor Who, and honestly, I agree, as do I think 99% of people who watch classic Who. You'll see why as I go into the actual ratings and stuff, but the only real difference from this season to the previous one is that Philip Hinchcliffe and Robert Holmes fully took over their roles as script editor and producer, opposite way around. But yeah, the only other thing is Harry's departure at the start of this season, mostly because Terror of the Zygons was meant to be part of season 12. I really wish it was. I think it would have been an amazing conclusion to that season, but hey ho, we can't always live in perfection. Now when it comes to season 13 itself, this is when the show gets much darker tonally. If you look at stories like The Ark in Space and Genesis of the Daleks for their level of tone, that's pretty much going to define these next 2 seasons. And there's definitely room for improvement when it comes to the horror tones of Doctor Who. And these 2 seasons really do solidify how good horror Doctor Who can be. Terror of the Zygons is an honest classic. Despite only appearing in this story, the Zygons became one of the most iconic classic Who villains of all time. Which, like I said, is so strange. They appear in this one story and that's it. Something I still don't really understand. They've appeared more in the modern era than they have the classic, and that's just insane to me. When it comes to the actual plot itself, it's really entertaining. Kind of silly still, a bit like some parts of season 12, but really starting to show the more darker horror aspects, especially with the lighting throughout this entire story. Harry's great and has a really good send-off. Obviously, Sarah Jane and the Doctor are perfect and really start to solidify the chemistry between Tom Baker and Elizabeth Sladen throughout this story. And yeah, it's honestly great. My only real issue is all the stuff around the Loch Ness Monster. I don't think it really fits into the plot very well, and I also think it looks really silly. But yeah, overall, this is a great start to season 13. and as you'll see from later on, hardly falters. Emphasis on the word hardly falters, because honestly, Planet of Evil is the weak link of this season and the next. I honestly don't hate this story as much as some people do. I'd say it's definitely the weakest out of the entirety of the Hinchcliffe era, but the visuals in this are gorgeous. The way they built the forest and all that in a BBC studio on a BBC budget in the 70s is really impressive, and it looks beautiful. Even the antimatter monster looks quite impressive for the time, but everything else is very bland and generic. The plot itself is one of the most generic This Is a Doctor Who plots of all time. Sarah and Tom are on top form as always, but yeah, this plot is so drab and this story drags. I think if this was a 3-parter instead of a 4, it would be much better, but overall, disappointing, but gorgeous visuals. 5 out of 10. Pyramids of Mars is a sum up as to the reason why people love the Hinchcliffe era. It is a horror film that happens to have the Doctor and Sarah Jane in it. That's it. This is a full-on sci-fi horror film, like the kind of stuff that Hammer horror films would make. The acting in this story is incredible. The sets, the costume design, all of it looks way bigger budget than what this production would have actually had. And when it comes to the plot, it's constantly got twists and turns, constantly interesting, constantly intriguing. I honestly cannot flaw this story. There is a reason why Pyramids of Mars is still referenced to this day in Doctor Who. There's a reason it was the one chosen for the Sarah Jane Adventures Seasons 1 to 5 box set to represent the classic era. It's Pyramids of Mars. There's a reason it's so loved. Solid 10 out of 10. I honestly can't fault it. Now for the story that most people would call the weak link of Season 13, and honestly, nah, you're insane. It's Invasion of the Body Snatchers, but with robots in Doctor Who universe. That's just fun. Like, this story is very dumb with the parallel kind of AI robot world thing that's going on in the first 2 episodes. But you know what? It's Doctor Who. I've seen people call this really stupid. But have you ever watched an episode of Doctor Who? There's a lot of parts which are really stupid and make no sense. This one at least has fun with it. The actual monsters this time look like Shrek on a diet. And I think it's a lot of fun. All the robot stuff is really fun. The cliffhanger with Sarah Jane's face falling off to reveal her as a robot is an iconic one. And I know that's a spoiler, but it's too iconic for people not to already know about it. Yeah, this is fun. It's bad at times, really stupid, but I find this a lot like I do with Revenge of the Cybermen, so it's another 7 out of 10. The Brain of Morbius feels a lot like a spiritual sequel to stuff like The Pyramids of Mars. It's very much a Hammer horror movie disguised as a Doctor Who episode. And yeah, it's iconic for a reason. This story is probably one of the darkest that Classic Who ever goes. It does feel like an actual horror film. Like, if this just had a bit more blood, I could easily see this as being released as an 18 rating back in the day. It's dark, it's eerie. The Sisters of Khan are obviously, nowadays, very iconic. Morbius himself is a full-on Frankenstein's monster creation. Everything about this screams horror and terror, and I love it. My only real problem, in all honesty, is I feel like this should have been the 6-parter of the season, as it does kind of rush to a conclusion in the 4th and final episode. But even still, this is an amazing story, a solid 9 out of 10. Then finally, we have The Seeds of Doom to end off this incredible season. And yep, it's honestly brilliant. Once again, pure Hammer horror level stuff, mostly kind of focusing on an environmental message, similar to the 3rd Doctor's era this time. And yeah, it's great. Sarah and the Doctor are incredible. A lot of the cast in this one for the supporting actors are really good in the roles. I love seeing the old unit building before it was a unit building. That's just a really fun little detail. And yeah, this is a great story. I really enjoy it. Its honest main issue is how long it is. Like I said previously, I feel like The Brain of Morbius should have been the 6th part of this season, And The Seeds of Dome kind of proves my point. It's a bit too long, especially episodes 4 and 5, which feel like they're really dragging to get to the finale. But overall, it's still a great story. I just wish the episode lengths with this one and Morbius were swapped over. Still, 8 out of 10, easy. And that's season 13, definitely one of the strongest Doctor Who seasons ever, along with pretty much everything during the Hinchcliffe era, which, yes, I am a Hinchcliffe apologist, please don't hate me. Now, the only real weak point of this season, as you can see from my ratings, is Planet of Evil. I don't hate it as much as normal people do, but it's definitely not the best out there when it comes to plot and how fucking boring it can get. But overall, I'd say the season is very consistent. I even like the goddamn androids. I know it's not the best, but same thing as I said with the Cybermen, it's turn your brain off fun, and there's nothing wrong with that too. Yeah, this season's great. Honestly, really enjoyable season. I cannot wait until the collection box set comes out because they are holding back on this one for a reason. They cannot wait until they release it and see a massive sales success. There's a reason season 13 is regarded as one of the peak seasons of Doctor Who. And even though I wouldn't say it's the best season overall, it's easily in the top 5, no questions. I once saw on Facebook season 14 described as season 13 the sequel, and in all honesty, that's pretty damn true. This season, as you'll see as we go along, is just more of season 13. In all honesty, you could probably just watch them back to back and think they're the same season, because there are that many similarities when it comes to writing tone and pacing. And when it comes to the success of season 13, I can definitely see and completely agree with their reasoning to just continue doing more of that. Season 14 is also one of my favourite seasons, as I'll get into later on, and it's massively acclaimed from fans as well. Once again, this entire little trilogy from seasons 12 to 14 is known as the Golden Age of Doctor Who for a reason, and I'm inclined to agree. There is, of course, a departure in this season, which we'll get to, don't you worry, but it also introduces one of the best companions when it comes to Classic Who. But enough out of the way, let's get straight into this season. The Mask of Mandragora is honestly the weak point of season 14. It feels very slur and dry at times, just a usual historical without much really in the flair. It's honestly kind of disappointing that this is the second to last story with Sarah Jane, because it just feels very generic. There's a lot of feelings similar to this one that I have for Planet of Evil. When it comes to the sets and costumes and stuff, this story is second to none. But when it comes to the actual plot, I feel like I've seen it for the previous 13 seasons over and over again, and by this point, it's gotten very boring and repetitive. The only real interesting part is all the stuff with Elizabeth Sladen as Sarah Jane. She has a really amazing performance throughout this entire story that I don't think people acknowledge enough. And because of that, I have to give this one a 5 out of 10. I know a lot of people would rank it lower, but like I said, I don't think Elizabeth gets enough credit for this story, as she is captivating throughout. Speaking of Elizabeth Sladen's performances, we finally have The Hand of Thea, which is, sadly, her final proper story in Doctor Who. And when it comes to a plot, it's once again very generic, sadly. A lot of The Hand of Thea feels just like a usual Doctor Who episode. There's nothing special, there's nothing unique, it's just generic Doctor Who plot. Now, Eldrad is a pretty cool villain. I like how they constantly evolve and change throughout the course of the story and throughout different parts of the episodes. But apart from that, this is a relatively decent, if not great, story until the final 5 minutes. Sarah Jane's departure honestly always makes me a little bit teary-eyed. The performances between both her and Tom Baker are incredible. You can feel how sad both the actors actually are that this is the end, but they had so much fun together in the previous 2 seasons and these 2 little serials that it's all worth it. And yeah, this story's good. I'd have to give it a 7 out of 10, but I wish it was better for Sarah Jane's finale. The Deadly Assassin's very unique for Classic Who, as it's the only story to have no companions at all and just focus on the Doctor. Honestly, I wish they did it more. This episode is one of the best Doctor Who stories of all time. The only gripe I have is how quickly all of the Gallifreyan Council is to immediately accuse the Doctor without properly checking on anything. But even so, that kind of falls in line with them. I just think it's a little bit convoluted to get to the plot. But as a plot, it's perfect. All the stuff with the Master, all the stuff with the Matrix, all the power dynamics. Sutekh is one of my favourite classic era characters of all time. Tom is giving a solid 11 out of 10 performance throughout the entire story. This story goes to horrifically dark places. It launched a massive campaign of complaints due to how violent it even got with the Doctor. Yeah, this is a solid 9 out of 10. I just wish we didn't have a bit of a convoluted beginning to get to the amazing rest of the story. The Face of Evil would have been the greatest 3-part story of all time when it comes to Classic Who. But it's a 4-parter, and it's really slow at times. Now, this story introduces one of my favourite companions with Leela, as she is genuinely perfect, and Louise Jameson could not have been better casting for the role. I really love her as a companion. I really love her entire style, her character, and even though they didn't get along off screen, her chemistry with Tom Baker on screen is honestly really good. My issue with this is the same issue that I have with Elizabeth Sladen's final story. I wish it was better for these characters and for these actresses. This story is kind of generic. There's some cool elements going on about the Doctor's influence on stuff in the future and how much they can impact things. But I don't think the story goes enough into it to actually make it interesting enough. But still, this is a really good introduction for Leela, a solid 7 out of 10. The Robots of Death is one of the funniest, darkest at times, most entertaining murder mystery things I've ever seen. Never mind the fact it's a Doctor Who story. Just in general, The Robots of Death is incredible. The levels of comedy at times, the silliness it can get to, completely juxtaposed with how dark, brutal and violent this story gets, is a massive, massive welcome shift throughout this. I honestly love The Robots of Death. I know a lot of people have started to dislike it in recent years, and I don't understand why. This is a 10 out of 10 story. Everything about this is perfect. The only minor issue I can find is some of the blue screening is a bit dodgy. But this is also the 1970s. If you're expecting perfect CG from a BBC budget, you're watching the wrong show. Watch Robots of Death now. Genuinely, it's such a fun time. The Talons of Wen Cheyenne is honestly one of the greatestly written pieces of media I've ever seen. Everything about it is flawless. The characters, the cause and effect, all of it. The plotline is perfection. I don't know how it was done so perfectly, but it was. And when it comes to the acting of the main two, absolutely incredible, cannot fault them even slightly. When it comes to Jaco and Lightfoot, absolutely perfect, cannot fault them slightly. But I cannot deny the level of racism in this episode. And honestly, it drags this serial down massively for me. I understand some people try and say it's 1970s, it was acceptable then, but in all honesty, it wasn't by the 70s. A lot of stuff had started to say this isn't acceptable anymore. The fact this still exists then was shocking, and yeah, you can excuse the yellow face if you want to, but you can't excuse the voice. It drags down this story to an 8 out of 10, which should be a solid 10 out of 10. But yeah, there's too much racism, I'm sorry. And that's season 14. Honestly, a very good season overall, minus some interesting repetitive storytelling and some curious levels of racism in the final story. I honestly think that overall, Philip Hinchcliffe went out on a bang with his final season. I wish a couple of the stories were a bit more new and fresh, and obviously no racist shit in the final one. But he really should be proud of the 3 seasons that he did. They are some of the best in Classic Who, and honestly some of the best in Doctor Who in general. This is what I'd give each story as my ratings. As you can see, I'm not the biggest fan of the first one, and the second one and the fourth one are a bit better, but oh, that third and fucking fifth episode, I absolutely love the Robots of Death. And even though the talent of Wang Chen have some of the worst racism I've ever seen when it comes to television, that storytelling is so perfect. It's Doctor Who meets Sherlock Holmes. What's not to love? Apart from, Yellowface. Overall, though, this season, as you can see from my rankings, it's really good. Robots of Death #1, no question there. And it's, like I said, a really good way for the Hinchcliffe era to roll off. I'm sad he didn't stay for season 15, but I'm at least glad that Robert Holmes stayed for the first 3/4 stories of season 15, as you'll see, my opinions on the next season are a bit more mixed than these last 3. Season 15 was definitely part of a tumultuous time when it comes to Classic Who. Showrunners had been swapped over, cast was starting to become a little bit unhappy, especially when it comes to Louise Jameson, and overall the tone of the show after the very dark and horror-themed last 2 seasons was about to be drastically shifted by the BBC. This season honestly feels like a transitionary season between the much darker seasons 12 to 14 and the much lighter seasons 16 to 18, but as you'll see, I don't think the shift is exactly for the show's best interest overall. Now, season 15 is very much derided or just forgotten by a lot of people who like Doctor Who. I would disagree with that. I'd say this season definitely has some really strong points that I'll get into, but also has some very weak points too. I don't think this season should be as forgotten as it is as the weird little middle child in the Tom Baker era, but I don't exactly disagree that it's probably one of the weirdest ones when it comes to quality, as you'll see. The horror of Fang Rock is such a leftover from the previous 2 seasons. It's pure hammer horror once again, and it's honestly an amazing way to kind of wrap up what Hinchcliffe did with seasons 12 to 14. I love the horror of Fang Rock. It's so dark, it's so brutal, it's so disturbing and genuinely kind of creepy at times. I have no idea how this passed the BBC's new quality control when it comes to violence on television, because this is probably more violent than most of the stuff on the previous 2 seasons. But I love it. Louise Jameson is perfect, and she can finally get rid of those contact lenses so she can show her natural eye colour, because, yeah, that was weirdly a thing in season 14. Tom Baker's on complete top form, and I loved the fact we were finally able to see what the Sontarans' greatest enemies, the Rootans, actually looked like. This is a solid 10 out of 10. I cannot find a flaw in it. It's perfect. For a lot of fans, The Invisible Enemy is when the show started to go downhill into a more kid-friendly direction, and I can definitely see that. This is essentially Fantastic Voyage, but done with Doctor Who, and with a robot dog. But I really like The Invisible Enemy. I think it's entertaining. It's really silly, and reminds me a lot of Revenge of the Cybermen and the Android Invasion, but I like both those stories, and this feels like both of those style of stories, with the silliness ramped up to 11, but with a much more interesting plot, and, in all honesty, much better acting. And this introduces K9. What's not to love there? Yes, the monster itself for the virus looks very silly, but once again, this is Classic Who. Every monster looks silly. One of the most acclaimed stories of all time is Bubble Wrap. I mean, come on. It's not that bad, guys. This is honestly an 8 out of 10 for me, which I know is probably going to annoy some people, but I really like The Invisible Enemy. Image of a Fandal feels like the true grand finale when it comes to the horror elements of Classic Who by this point. It's a really good send-off to the genre. This is something that was apparently already commissioned by Holmes way before all the shifts for this season happened, and I'm really glad it stayed. Image of the Fandal is dark, it's brutal, it's disturbing, and honestly, this would be a solid 10 out of 10 if it wasn't for the Fendalines. The moment someone pointed out that it's just a bad version of like a Triffid mixed with a dildo, I cannot look at them any other way apart from that now. And it's really ruined parts of the story for me. Overall though, I'd still say this is an 8 out of 10. It's so entertaining, it's so dark, it's so fun, it's so Tom Baker's early Doctor Who era, wrapped up in a nice little finale bow. I'm really happy this is how Robert Holmes went out as script editor, and yeah, like I said, 8 out of 10. Speaking of Robert Holmes, this is the transitionary story between script editors. So from what I can tell, Holmes did do some editing for his own writing for the Sunmakers, but it was mostly done by brand new script editor Anthony Reid. And yeah, this is a really good ending for Holmes' career. Well, for what we thought was Holmes' career with Doctor Who. It's a really interesting story. There's still a lot of dark elements in it, but it has been lightened for this new era. I really like how this is essentially Robert Holmes got really mad that he had to pay his taxes, so he wrote an entire Doctor Who serial to say screw you to the tax man. It's funny, it's silly at times. Leela gets a ton to do in this story and is such a good character throughout. The Doctor's on top form, which, to be honest, Tom Baker had kind of been waning in the past 2 stories, so it's really nice to see him kicking ass again. Yeah, this is an 8 out of 10, really fun, amazing ending to Robert Holmes. Underworld is where the new era of Tom Baker's Doctor really starts to lose me. Now, I wouldn't actually say this story is as bad as most people do. A lot of people have issues with the blue screen and the CFO and all that stuff. I don't mind it at times. I think it does look bad, don't get me wrong. But you have to take into consideration the year that this was made and for the budget it was made on. It could have looked worse. I mean, look at Invasion of the Dinosaurs. This story could have looked much worse. Even so, the plot is relatively generic, but does have some interesting tie-ins to Gallifrey and Time Lord Society, which I do really like. The Doctor's really good in this. I liked seeing K9 actually do something properly this season, since he'd mostly been sidelined for the previous 2 stories, despite just being added as a companion. And yeah, this story is not as bad as people say, but it's not exactly great. I'd say it's decent overall, though. Now for a story that not many people like, and I honestly really do agree. Invasion of Time is one of the worst finales of Classic Who. It feels very dry, it feels very empty. I like the introductory 2 episodes with the Doctor acting really dark and weird, and Leela having no idea what's going on, but it all starts to fall apart. The story is way too long. It feels like 2 completely different plots that were stapled together at the last minute to get a 6-parter. The Sontarans come out of absolutely nowhere at the end of episode 4. The entire TARDIS set being what's obviously a disused hospital is really silly. And a lot of the Time Lord mythology stuff in this story, it is interesting, but it's stuff that we'd explored literally the previous year with A Deadly Assassin. Leela's departure is also really anticlimactic and honestly kind of sexist. It's just kind of disappointing this is how the new era properly starts, because yeah, it's not great, it's a 4 out of 10. Honestly, when it comes to season 15, my interest in it drops off the moment Robert Holmes leaves the show. Now, he does come back later on down the line, but you can feel his presence end during this season, and the last 2 stories are quite disappointing to me, especially the finale. I know in recent years the Invasion of Time has started to gain a fan base, and honestly, I'm very happy for them. I'm glad they enjoy it. I wish I could too. But yeah, season 15 feels like 2 completely different creative teams just constantly butting heads. Not sure which parts to keep, not sure which parts to get rid of. They just know they want a tonal change and will force it through no matter what. I mean, you can literally see from my ratings exactly where I think the season falls apart. And even when I change it to my rankings, as you can see, really not different. It's honestly a shame that this is how Holmes' final season went, and I wish Hinchcliffe stayed for this season. I think it would have fixed many of the issues, especially when it comes to the tone and the dryness of the last 2 stories, but well. I honestly will say there's much worse seasons. I don't think season 15 should be as hated as it is because, oh boy, I'm prepared to be controversial within my thoughts on the next season, don't you worry. Season 16 of Doctor Who was quite a strong tonal shift from all the previous seasons of the show. Not only did we have brand new creatives who were fully implemented at the end of season 15, we also had a brand new companion and a brand new way of telling the story of Doctor Who. For the first time in the show's history, all of the episodes are fully interconnected. Season 12 had a loose running plot thread throughout, but this is the first time Doctor Who had an actual season arc. I honestly love the idea of the season arc, and I'm a big fan of the key to time concept, but as you'll see, my opinions of this season aren't very great. I know a lot of people love this season, and I am really sorry that I'm about to completely tear it apart, but as you'll see, I think my grievances are justified. The Ribos operation is kind of a weird one to me. It's written by former series editor Robert Holmes, as I've mentioned a lot throughout this video, and it just feels off. There's something about this story to me that just doesn't feel complete. It feels like what it was, essentially, a script written by Holmes, which wasn't the best to begin with, and then rewritten by the script editor in order to fit this new series narrative, and it's not great. It's a medieval sci-fi one, but it feels off. I honestly struggle to describe what it is about this story, but every single time I think about it, I have to Google it and look at images to remind myself what actually happens. There's nothing here to remember. I love the intro with Romana and all the stuff with the White and Black Guardians. That stuff's really cool. But overall, I'd say this is a massively forgettable story, so it's a 4 out of 10. Now for something which is definitely a massive improvement in my opinion, The Pirate Planet is a lot more entertaining. This story is very fast-paced, which is both a positive and a negative. Some things feel really rushed and like they didn't really get expanded on enough, but nothing ever feels boring, I will state. All the stuff with the pirates are hilarious. I love the concept of a pirate planet. That's really cool, the way that it teleports around, and I won't spoil it, but the twist is pretty interesting. Romana and the Doctor are really good throughout this entire story. Some of the effects are a bit dodgy, but this is classic Who, what's to be expected. And the overall plot is really fun. My main issue with this is the same issue I had with the previous one with the key to time stuff. It feels like it was written in at the last minute to a story which didn't really connect enough with it. As well as the cheesiness of this story can hit 11 a few times, which is a bit too much for me. But overall, I'd say this is a good story and honestly the best of this season, just a heads up. The Stones of Blood is one of those Marmite stories. People online either absolutely love it and will defend it to high heaven, and some people really don't like it and detest it. I'm honestly on the detest side for this one. I don't mind the first 2 episodes, even though the Stones themselves are some of the weakest and most unthreatening horror-y villains I've ever seen. I love the old lady, by the way. She is great. I wish she was added as a companion. But then the second half happens and it suddenly turns into a comedic courtroom drama, and the tonal shift is complete whiplash. This is the first story I'd say actually fits into the key to time stuff. It doesn't feel like it was just added into random lines of dialogue, but that tonal shift is so aggressive. It feels like 2 completely different stories that were shoved together at the last minute, and it's an absolute writing mess. Nothing in the story really makes sense. Yeah, this story's bad, I'm sorry. It's a 3 out of 10. The Androids of Tara is a weird one. I'm never the biggest fan of historical stories when it comes to medieval times. I think medieval, especially in Classic Who, is overly played out. I mean, it was literally done at the start of this season with a medieval-styled thing. But for some reason, the Androids of Tara kind of works for me. I love all the androidy stuff, all the constant betrayals that aren't actually betrayals because everyone's a robot and all that stuff. It's fun and entertaining, and really does shine a light on this season overall. My main issue is how slow this story can get at times. Tom Baker looks bored, which is weird, because in the rest of the stories of this season, even the ones I don't like, he feels very energetic. Whilst a lot of the time in The Androids of Tara, he just doesn't seem to care. I'm not sure if he didn't like the script, or if he just me not thinking properly, but so it feels off about Baker throughout. I'd still say this is a good story and a solid 7 out of 10. I just wish something is missing. I want to know what it is. The Power of Kroll is Holmes' second script for this season, and is the first kaiju script when it comes to Doctor Who, and Kroll is the biggest monster at the time that this season was made. Oh, that's really cool. I also really like the jolly green giants throughout the story. They don't look silly at all. This story gets a lot of flack for bad special effects, especially when it comes to Kroll itself, as well as how generic the story is, and I'll definitely agree that this story is relatively genetic. Once again, it's a tribal cult who worship some kind of deity, very similar to many other stories in Classic Who, whilst at the same time, there's properly sci-fi people doing their own shtick, and the two don't like each other. See the mutants for more info. But I honestly disagree when it comes to the special effects. As a big fan of the Godzilla franchise, trust me, there is much worse kaiju effects than Kroll. The story overall is fine. I'd give this a solid 6 out of 10, mostly for the kaiju-y stuff that I enjoy, but yeah, still not great, another disappointing one from Holmes. And speaking of disappointing stories, the Armageddon Factor. All honesty, this 6-parter should be a 4. It drags so aggressively throughout almost the entirety of the story. I can't believe this was written by Bob Baker. I don't get how he wrote this. This story is honestly a mess and feels very similar to the previous seasons of The Invasion of Time, where the first 4 episodes feel mostly like its own story, and then the last 2 are also their own story, but more of a sequel to the previous one. It's another mess. Honestly, this story is only better than The Invasion of Time and is not being given a 4 out of 10, completely because of Drax and Tom Baker's acting. They're both incredible. I also love Romana throughout it. It's fun, it's silly. Lala Ward's introduced in this story, which is also a nice thing, but overall, this story can drag. Like I said, if it wasn't for Drax, this story would be a 4 out of 10, so I guess I'll give it a 5. And that's season 16 of the Key to Time season of Doctor Who. I don't like it, as you can probably tell. I don't despise this season. It's definitely not my least favourite Doctor Who season, although it's definitely in my bottom 5. I think the main issue with this season is how bland the stories feel. There's not much unique about any of them. The most unique stuff is the giant kaiju storyline, which still isn't the best, and the androidy stuff, which once again still isn't the best. The Pirate Planet, which is a cool concept, but the pacing of that one's a bit off. Nothing about this season feels right to me. I understand that it might just be I don't like the production team for this season, with Andrew Reid taking over as script editor. I don't think he's as good or talented as Holmes, no offence to him, and Graham Williams is probably one of my least favourite Doctor Who producers, so maybe it's just a culmination of all that. But as you can see from my actual ratings of the episode, nothing even breaks an 8 out of 10. I know people love this season, I am really sorry to those people for this, but even when I change them over to my rankings, yeah, this season, it's not one of my favourites. I wish I liked it more, because I love the concept of the Key to Time, but overall, this is one of the most disappointing seasons of Classic Who for me, and it's only marginally improved upon with the next. Emphasis on the marginally. Season 17 is another important time in Doctor Who history, as it's yet another tonal shift, only 2 years after the previous one. Now, seasons 15 and 16 were definitely lighter than the previous three, but were still a bit bland in my opinion, and season 17 tried to fix that by adding a ridiculous amount of comedy throughout it. It's something which has caused controversy as well when it comes to Doctor Who fans about if this season's loved or hated. I'm kind of in the middle, as you'll see as we go along. I think in some stories it works really well, in some others it doesn't so much. This season also introduces Lila Ward as Romana too, mostly due to her previous Romana actress just not wanting to do another one, which, you know, fair enough. Anthony Reid also has stepped down as script editor to be replaced by the absolute legend that is the incredible Douglas Adams. Yes, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy Douglas Adams. So let's see how he does and get into this season properly. Destiny of the Daleks is honestly not the best start to this season, and it kind of sucks that this is one of the most watched Doctor Who stories of all time. My main issue when it comes to Destiny of the Daleks is how bad some of her writing is. Now, it's weird that this is Terry Nation's final proper Doctor Who script, because it's an absolute mess, something which was massively rewritten by Douglas Adams, because it just didn't work, and I don't think Adams understood the Daleks enough. When it comes to the comedy, this is honestly one of the funniest Doctor Who stories of all time. I find it hilarious. I quote so many of the jokes throughout it. But when it comes to the effects of the Daleks themselves that are obviously falling apart, Davros, who is obviously falling apart, the script itself, which is literally falling apart, and how generic it is as a Dalek story, all that kind of sucks. But Lila Ward's amazing as Romana, and like I said, this story is so funny, so it's a mixed bag, 5 out of 10. City of Death has always been counted as that standout story of the entirety of the Williams era, and I agree. City of Death is probably one of the best written Doctor Who stories for quite a while. It's interesting, it's intriguing, there's a lot of plot twists, all the stuff being shot in Paris is beautiful. Lila Ward and Tom Baker are absolutely perfect in this story. The amount of chemistry they both have with each other is incredible. I love the detective. I wish he got added as a companion, as like a classic Who version of River Song, because he just likes to shoot everything and is absolutely just bland with all of his deliveries, but in the best kind of way, in that kind of silly detective blandness. Yeah, City of Death is an absolute classic. My only issue, in all honesty, is that I feel like the ending was ridiculously rushed and came straight out of nowhere in the final couple of minutes. It's a shame, but overall, 9 out of 10. Incredible story. Creature from the Pit, from what I've seen online, is also a Marmite story, mostly down to the design of the creature from the pit. Now, I actually kind of like this story. I think it's good, it's fun, it's a bit silly. I don't mind the design of the creature from the pit because it looks like Camille from Red Dwarf, and, you know, if anyone wants to see me watch and rank all the Red Dwarfs, I'm fine doing that because I bloody love that show. And when it comes to the villain, she's so silly, she's so over the top. She honestly feels like a female version of Brian Blessed with all of her deliveries. But yeah, it's fun, it's stupid, it's silly. I honestly count this same as I do with stuff like Revenge of the Cybermen, as you've seen from earlier. I think it's fun, but it's not great. It's stupid, it's silly. I'd give this story a 7 out of 10. It's fun, but it's very dumb. And now we're on to Nightmare of Eden, which has got one of the most interesting plots I've seen Doctor Who attempt for a while, which it does partially succeed in, but this is one of the stories where the comedy does not work. This story feels like it should be very dark, very serious, very Doctor Who melodramatic, but the levels of ridiculous comedy that comes out of nowhere in what's obviously a dark, disturbing, almost horror-y script just doesn't work. The mandrills are meant to be terrifying from the way they're shot and described, but they look ridiculous. There's moments where like people are taken away and it should be horrific and terrifying, but then they're doing weird little screams, like the doctor shouting, "My leg, no, ah." it just feels like this story shouldn't have been, well, Douglas Adams. It's kind of a mess overall for its tone, and because of that, I can only give it a 5 out of 10, even if it is sort of entertaining. So, Nightmare of Eden 2 Electric Boogaloo, also known as The Horns of Nimon, is almost the same story as the previous one, but with a couple of minor differences, and the stories were released back to back. Oh no. This story has the exact same problems that I have with Nightmare on Eden. It feels like it should be terrifying, it should be horror-y, that's the vibe that the script has, but it adds a ton of silly over-the-top comedy throughout the entirety of it. And sometimes I'd honestly say, when it comes to the comedy, this one works better than Eden does, but it does just feel like Nightmare of Eden, but rewritten into something slightly different. It feels like Nightmare on Eden is like draft 1 of a script, whilst Horns of Nimon is draft 3 of the same script. They're too similar, and I don't think enough people acknowledge how ridiculously similar they are. And since this is technically the season finale, it's disappointing. But it still has entertainment value, so I guess I'll give it a 5 out of 10. Shada is part of Season 17. I know some people would disagree and say that it shouldn't be counted since it was never finished, but it was originally written for Season 17, it's now been finished due to the animations, it's part of the Season 17 box set. This is part of Season 17 and I'm including it. Tough shit. I honestly really like Shada. I think it's so intriguing. I think this is where Douglas Adams' comedy works the best, and it sucks it was never properly made at the time. A lot of the comedy in this is dark comedy, but with that hint of Douglas Adams' silliness. The acting throughout is incredible. Tom Baker is on complete top form, even during what are essentially early versions of what shouldn't have been final scenes in the original cut. It's really cool to see. I love Skagroth. He's one of the silliest but campest, funnest villains in Doctor Who history. I think the animation, I do just need to mention, is pretty damn good. Overall, this is a great story. I'm sad it was never properly made as the finale to Season 17. But as far as it goes for Douglas Adams' little contribution to Doctor Who, this is a great way to go out. It's an 8 out of 10. And that's Season 17. Quite a mixed bag. I mean, you can see my ratings here, how much the number 5 pops up throughout this season. It's honestly kind of a shame. I'd say it's still an improvement over Season 16 overall, but you can feel just how much this show has kind of lost where it wants to be. Is it silly or is it dark? It's unknown. You can't really mix the two well enough. I mean, the Horns of Nimon proves that. And when we change it over to the rankings, the best ones this season are the ones that tone down the comedy, in my opinion. Like, City of Death tones down a lot of the comedic levels. It still has a good couple of jokes. Same with Shada, which perfects the joke to darkness level. And even Creature from the Pit has its jokes, which are really stupid and silly. And that one works as just stupid and silly. But when they try to mix them way too much, like in the other 3 stories, it just doesn't work for me. I think it's one of the problems of Season 17. They wanted to stay dark-ish and proper true sci-fi, like the past 5 seasons of Tom Baker, but they also want to add a ton of silliness, and because of it, the scripts can just feel like an absolute mess. It has an absolute gems in this season. City of Death and Shada are brilliant, but overall, it's quite disappointing, but I do wish that Douglas Adams was given a second chance, and honestly, I wish that Graham Williams was given a second chance, because we're about to go through a very aggressive reboot. Season 18 has massively similar vibes to Season 15. This is a transition season into what's kind of like the final era of Doctor Who for the rest of the 80s. Since this season has so many differences, I'll try and list them as quick as I can. Romana and K9 both leave, Tom Baker departs as the Doctor to be replaced by Peter Davidson, we have 3 new companions being introduced with Adric, Tegan and Nyssa, as well as probably one of the most controversial people when it comes to Doctor Who taking over from Graham Williams with John Nathan Turner, or J&T. Now, this season is kind of messy because they try to make it much darker, but still focus on enough light to not get controversial. It kind of delves into darker sci-fi stuff, you know, more full-on sci-fi compared to sci-fi comedy, sci-fi horror, blah blah blah. It feels more like a sci-fi show than it had ever done before, and hard sci-fi at that. I think it works out sometimes, but doesn't others, but as you'll see, let's get into that. The Leisure Hive is honestly a really good introduction to this new era with its new tone. The sci-fi in this story feels much harder leaning. The outfit for Tom Baker is definitely my least favourite of all his outfits with the Pierre Burgundy, but you can feel the kind of tone they're going for. Lila Ward is great as always. Tom Baker is honestly not very good in this serial. He looks constantly fed up and angry due to behind the scenes issues, and K9 is essentially killed off throughout this season. So yeah, the Leisure Hive is definitely interesting. I like the plot when it comes to stuff like the Pharmacy and all that really cool stuff when it comes to politics, life, death, all that fun stuff. But overall, the Leisure Hive is a good introduction to this new era, but it's not great, so 7 out of 10. When it comes to tones and stuff, Meglos feels like a carbon copy of the Leisure Hive. Even though they have very different plots, thank God, they feel very similar in a strange way. It's difficult to describe, but when it comes to the tone of Doctor Who, each episode and storyline has to feel unique. Even if it's not, you'll be able to get it with a different tone through different directors. Meglos and the Leisure Hive, even though they've got completely different writers and directors, feel like a very long version of the same episode, just with very different plots. It's honestly strange. I do like the design of Meglos. I think it's basically silly to have an alien cactus, but in the best kind of Doctor Who way. It's also really nice to see Barbara's actress come back from the first Doctor's era. But yeah, Meglos is more interesting to look at than to properly experience. Even so, I'd probably give it a 6 out of 10. Full Circle is the first of what's known as the E-Space trilogy, and it's honestly when I'd say that this new version of Doctor Who starts to work for me. It feels very dark, but not horror. It's strange. I honestly really like how they've done the tone for this one. It feels more like a thriller compared to a horror film. Adric, despite being one of the most hated Classic Who companions, I think gets an amazing introduction in this story. I immediately quite like him and feel almost like I want to protect him as an audience member, which is something that sadly doesn't last. But overall, I'd say this is honestly great. This shows what the new era needs to be. Tom Baker seems to be much happier in this story as well. Lila Ward is also doing a great performance throughout. And yeah, I'd say the start of the E-Space trilogy is really good. It's a great story. 8 out of 10. The monsters are really cool too. State of Decay is one of those stories that was stuck in production hell. It was originally given for season 15 until it was pushed back due to stuff with BBC's version of Dracula. But I really think it works perfectly for this season, especially for this little E-Space trilogy. All the stuff with the vampires and the ancient vampires going to war with all of the Time Lords and stuff is honestly amazing. And the tone of this story feels off in the best kind of way, in the kind of stuff that you'd want for a parallel universe-styled storytelling. I love all the stuff to do with the crew of the original ship, which I won't get into details with. The vampire stuff is awesome. This feels very much like a season 12 to 14 story. Adric is great throughout, and his little naivety is kind of sweet at this point in time. And even though this is the episode where Tom Baker and Lila Ward were very angry at each other, I think it works because it feels like the characters are annoyed at each other for being stuck in this scenario. So, to me, all of this works perfectly. I can't find a flaw in State of Decay. So I'd have to give it a 10 out of 10. Warrior's Gate is the finale to the East-based trilogy, and I'd say it's kind of a whimper compared to a bang. I like the concept of what they're trying to do with the story. It's very high-concept sci-fi, which a lot of the time I enjoy, but with this one, it just feels a bit messy. The idea of slave masters turning into slaves and slaves turning into slave masters is interesting and stuff, but it just makes me dislike all of the characters, knowing that no matter what, these people will be horrible to each other and to everyone else, including their own race and stuff. All of the characters, apart from the main group, are detestable people. Both the, lion people and the humans. I don't like any of these people, so why should I care about their problems? I think the effects in this story are also really trippy and I don't like them. I get why they had to do them due to the budget and the effects capabilities at the time, but yeah, I'd say overall this is disappointing, and Romana and K9's exit is so underwritten. But I like for what they're trying to do, so I guess I'll give them a 4 out of 10. The Keeper of Traken is honestly quite a generic story when it comes to Doctor Who. The only real interesting part is all the stuff with the Master and with Nyssa. Everything else feels very generic medieval society in a sci-fi future level stuff that we've seen countless times by this point in Doctor Who. Honestly, the first 3 episodes of this are boring. The only positives is the building relationship between Adric and the Doctor and the introduction of Nyssa, who becomes one of the most companions of all time. And no, I didn't miss a word before companions are. I honestly think it's a shame that this is Tom Baker's second to final story and the introduction of a long-term companion, but hey, it brings back the Master and has Anthony Ainley doing his really good version of the Master in the final couple of minutes, and honestly, his performance as Nyssa's dad is also really sweet. I'd give this story a 6 out of 10. It's decent, but better stuff is definitely on the way. And finally, for the 7-season run for Tom Baker, we have Logopolis introducing one of the best companions of all time with Tegan. Now, this is Tom Baker's final story, so I'll just quickly mention all 3 companions in this one are great, even Nyssa, which is rare. The Master is also on top form of Anthony Ainley's silly, over-the-top performance, which is really entertaining in my opinion. And yeah, this is Tom's story. Everything about this, every single shot Tom Baker's in, you can feel how solemn, but almost excited he is throughout the entirety of it. Logopolis also has a very interesting plot when it comes to how the universe in Doctor Who works. I love all the stuff with the split realities happening, how time is bleeding in on itself. It's really cool, and the Doctor Master team-up is really fun. And Tom's final line and his performance, perfection. I wish the story was a bit better written, but yeah, this is a great finale. 8 out of 10. And that's season 18. I definitely prefer it to the previous 2 seasons, but it's definitely not perfect. As you can see from my ratings for this season, a lot of them are kind of in the middle ground between 6 and 7, with a 4 and a 10 kind of shoved in there. It's not perfect. I'd still say this is a massive improvement on the previous 2 seasons, but it feels a bit bland. I don't think this season is as bad as a lot of people say, and I also wouldn't say that Tom Baker and Lila Ward's arguments on set really affected the stories in a negative way. I'd honestly say that they kind of made State of Decay even better in a way. But yeah, this season is an interesting, if not perfect, start to this new era throughout the rest of the 80s, and as you'll see from the rest of the 80s, it honestly does sum up the rest of the run of Doctor Who pretty damn well. Interesting, but not perfect. And I'll just change them over to my rankings now before I forget. And yeah, I'd say that's pretty solid. State of Decay is really, really good, and I think a lot of people are sleeping on how good this story is. But there's definitely some duds, and Warrior's Gate is that dud. Even so, that's the end of the ridiculousness that is the Fourth Doctor's massive 7-year run. And next week, we'll be looking at the Fifth Doctor's era. Or if you want to, you can check out the super long 4-hour-long video that I did all the way back on the 11th of May. But until then, toodles.